A janitor inherited a $12 million mansion from a billionaire, but his daughter decided to do something that shocked everyone. Quick question for the comments section. Could you ever fall in love with someone trying to destroy your life? Someone from a completely different world who sees you as their enemy? Hit the comments and tell me if love can really conquer all, or if some gaps are just too wide to bridge. This story will either restore your faith in humanity or make you question everything about justice and class in America. Marcus Rivera had been pushing a mop across the floors of Westfield Academy in New York for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd perfected the art of invisibility. Students rushed past him as if he were part of the furniture, their designer shoes squeaking against the pristine hallways he maintained with meticulous care. At 34, Marcus had grown comfortable with his solitude, finding peace in the rhythm of his work and the satisfaction of transforming chaos into order. The academy catered to the children of the wealthy elite, and Marcus had learned early on that acknowledging their existence beyond a polite nod was unwelcome. He was the help, a necessary but forgettable part of their privileged world. Yet he observed them all, their dramas, their struggles, their victories, with the quiet attention of someone who understood that everyone, regardless of their bank account, was fundamentally human. This perspective would prove more valuable than he could ever imagine. Harrison Whitmore III was dying, and everyone at Westfield Academy knew it. The billionaire industrialist's grandson, Jamie, had been Marcus's favorite student to watch from afar. Not because the boy was particularly exceptional, but because he seemed genuinely kind. Unlike his peers who barely registered Marcus's presence, Jamie would offer a shy smile or a quiet "thank you" when Marcus held a door open. The Whitmore family fortune had been built on steel and smart investments, creating an empire that spanned generations. Harrison's own son had died in a car accident years earlier, leaving Jamie as the sole heir to a vast fortune. But money couldn't buy the old man more time, and the weight of legacy pressed heavily on the 16-year-old's shoulders. Marcus often noticed Jamie sitting alone in the courtyard during lunch, staring at his phone with the burden of expectation written across his young face. The accident happened on a Tuesday in May, when the Connecticut spring had finally shaken off winter's grip and filled the academy grounds with the sweet scent of blooming dogwood. Marcus was cleaning the windows of the library that overlooked the ornamental pond when he heard the splash. At first, he thought it might be a prank. Wealthy teenagers were notorious for their elaborate schemes, but something about the sound made him look closer. Jamie Whitmore was in the water, and he wasn't swimming. The boy thrashed wildly, his expensive blazer weighing him down as he fought against the deep end of the decorative pond. Marcus didn't hesitate. Dropping his cleaning supplies, he sprinted across the manicured lawn and dove into the murky water fully clothed, his janitor's uniform becoming a second skin as he swam toward the drowning teenager with powerful, determined strokes. The water was colder than Marcus expected, shocking his system as he reached Jamie just as the boy went under for the third time. Muscle memory from his high school swimming days kicked in as Marcus grabbed Jamie around the chest and pulled him toward the surface. The teenager was deadweight now, unconscious and frighteningly still, his lips already taking on a blue tinge that made Marcus's heart race with panic. Hauling Jamie onto the stone edge of the pond, Marcus immediately began CPR, pressing rhythmically on the boy's chest while silently praying to whatever gods might be listening. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, Jamie coughed violently, expelling pond water and gasping for air. As sirens wailed in the distance, Marcus held the shivering teenager, whispering reassurances until the paramedics arrived. He never considered himself a hero, just a man who did what anyone should do. Marcus sat in the sterile waiting room of Connecticut General Hospital, his damp clothes long since dried but still smelling faintly of pond water and algae. The paramedics had insisted he come for observation, though he felt fine. What worried him was Jamie, who had been whisked away the moment they arrived, surrounded by a team of doctors and the unmistakable aura of wealth that commanded immediate attention. Harrison Whitmore III arrived like a force of nature, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the emergency, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Marcus's rumpled uniform. The old man's eyes were sharp and calculating, but Marcus caught a glimpse of something else beneath the surface, genuine fear for his grandson. When Harrison's gaze finally landed on Marcus, sitting quietly in the corner, the billionaire's expression shifted to something resembling gratitude, though he said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful words were the ones left unspoken. 3 days later, Marcus returned to work at Westfield Academy, expecting everything to return to normal. He'd answered questions from administrators and signed some paperwork, but the incident felt surreal now, like something that had happened to someone else. His supervisor had gruffly told him to take the week off, but Marcus preferred the comfort of routine to sitting alone in his small apartment with his thoughts. He was reorganizing the supply closet when Harrison Whitmore appeared in the doorway, looking distinctly out of place among the mops and cleaning chemicals. The billionaire was smaller than Marcus had imagined, probably in his 70s, with intelligent blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "Mr. Rivera," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk." Marcus set down the bottle of floor cleaner he'd been holding, wondering what else could possibly be said about an act that had required no thought, only instinct. Harrison Whitmore's office overlooked Manhattan from the 42nd floor, all glass and chrome, and the kind of view that reminded visitors exactly how high they'd climbed. Marcus felt profoundly out of place in his freshly pressed janitor's uniform, but Harrison had insisted on meeting here rather than at the school. The billionaire moved slowly behind his massive desk. Age showing in the careful way he lowered himself into his leather chair. "You saved my grandson's life," Harrison said without preamble, his voice thick with emotion. "Jamie is everything to me. My only family, my legacy, my future. And you risked everything to pull him from that water." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to such raw gratitude from a man who probably owned more money than Marcus would see in several lifetimes. "Sir, anyone would have done the same thing," Marcus replied quietly. Harrison's laugh was sharp and bitter. "No, Mr. Rivera. Anyone wouldn't. Most people would have called for help and waited for someone else to take the risk." What Harrison proposed next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about the world. The billionaire slid a thick legal document across the polished surface of his desk, the papers pristine and official-looking. "This is the deed to my estate in Millbrook," Harrison said, watching Marcus's face carefully. 43 rooms, 15 acres, worth approximately $12 million. "I'm giving it to you." Marcus stared at the papers without touching them, certain he'd misunderstood. "Sir, I can't possibly accept something like this. It's too much." But Harrison was already shaking his head, his expression fierce with determination. "It's not enough. It will never be enough. That house has been in my family for 60 years, but what good is legacy if there's no family left to inherit it? Jamie will have more than enough when I'm gone. But you gave me the most precious gift imaginable. You gave me more time with my grandson." The weight of such generosity felt crushing, but Marcus could see in the old man's eyes that refusing would be an insult to something deeper than money. Whitmore Manor had been built in 1962 by Harrison's father, a steel magnate who believed that a man's home should reflect his success. The Georgian-style mansion sat on a hill overlooking the Housatonic River, its red brick facade and white columns designed to evoke old money and established power. Marcus drove up the circular driveway for the first time as the owner, still unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. The house was exactly as he remembered from his monthly cleaning visits. grand, imposing, and somehow lonely despite its elegance. Harrison had employed Marcus's cleaning service for the past 3 years, though the old man rarely visited the estate anymore, preferring his Manhattan penthouse. Now, walking through rooms filled with priceless antiques and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, Marcus felt like an intruder in someone else's life. The silence was profound, broken only by his footsteps echoing off the marble floors he'd mopped countless times as an employee, never imagining he'd one day walk them as an owner. Moving into Whitmore Manor was like stepping into a fairy tale written by someone with exquisite taste and unlimited resources. Marcus had sold his few possessions and given up his apartment, but his belongings looked pathetic in the mansion's master suite. A single duffel bag of clothes, a few books, and an old laptop, the sum total of a life lived simply and without pretension. The first night was the hardest. Marcus lay in a bed worth more than his annual salary, staring at the coffered ceiling and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. The house groaned and settled around him, full of sounds he didn't recognize, and every shadow seemed to whisper that he didn't belong. But morning brought clarity. This wasn't about worthiness or belonging. It was about honoring a gift given in love and gratitude. Harrison Whitmore had entrusted him with something precious, and Marcus would prove himself worthy of that trust, even if it meant learning to live in a world he'd never imagined entering. Autumn painted the Connecticut hills in brilliant reds and golds, and Marcus had settled into a routine that felt almost natural. He'd kept his job at Westfield Academy despite Harrison's protests, needing the familiarity of work he understood. The mansion had begun to feel less like a museum and more like a home, though he still caught himself tiptoeing through certain rooms as if he were still the hired help. Jamie visited occasionally, usually on weekends when he could escape from the academy. The boy seemed healthier, the weight of his near-death experience gradually lifting as teenage resilience worked its magic. They would sit in the library, Jamie working on homework while Marcus read, comfortable in each other's silence. These visits meant everything to Marcus, proof that his sacrifice had meaning beyond the material gift he'd received. He'd saved more than a life. He'd preserved a future full of possibility. Marcus was trimming the hedges near the front gate when his phone rang, the international number appearing on the screen with an area code he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and distinctly female with just a hint of an accent that suggested expensive European education. "Mr. Rivera? This is Victoria Whitmore. I'm Harrison Whitmore's daughter, calling from Paris. I understand you're living in my family's house." The tone was polite but cold, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted. Marcus set down his pruning shears, suddenly aware that his peaceful existence was about to be challenged. "Ms. Whitmore," he replied carefully, "your father was very generous. I'm taking good care of the property." Her laugh was like ice crystals falling. "I'm sure you are. We need to meet, Mr. Rivera. I'll be arriving in New York tomorrow, and I think it's time we discussed the future of Whitmore Manor." Marcus spent the rest of the day researching Victoria Whitmore online, discovering a woman whose life seemed designed to intimidate. At 31, she was the chief operating officer of a luxury hotel chain in Europe, with an MBA from Wharton and a reputation for transforming failing properties into profitable enterprises. Photos showed a striking woman with dark hair and sharp features, always impeccably dressed and never smiling. The articles painted her as brilliant but ruthless, someone who could increase a company's value by 30% while laying off half its workforce without losing a moment of sleep. She'd been estranged from her father for nearly a decade, reportedly over his refusal to name her as his heir in favor of her nephew Jamie. Now she was coming home, and Marcus suspected it wasn't for a family reunion. He spent the evening reading legal documents, trying to understand exactly what rights he had to a property that felt too good to be true. Victoria Whitmore arrived at the manor precisely at 3 o'clock on a gray November afternoon, stepping out of a black town car with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. She was smaller than Marcus had expected but commanded attention nonetheless, her charcoal wool coat and leather gloves suggesting wealth so understated it didn't need to announce itself. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her green eyes missed nothing as they swept over the property. Marcus waited for her at the front door, suddenly self-conscious about his casual clothes and calloused hands. Up close, Victoria was undeniably beautiful, but there was something glacial about her perfection, as if she'd been carved from expensive marble. "Mr. Rivera," she said, extending a hand that felt cold even through her glove. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I trust you won't mind if we skip the pleasantries. I'm here to discuss your immediate vacation of my family's property." The library had always been Marcus's favorite room in the manor, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather chairs positioned near the massive fireplace. Now it felt like a battlefield as Victoria settled herself across from him, her posture perfect and her expression unreadable. She declined his offer of coffee or tea, clearly wanting to keep the meeting brief and businesslike. "My father was not in his right mind when he gave you this house," Victoria began, her voice clinical and detached. "Grief and guilt can make people do irrational things, and I'm afraid you've been the beneficiary of a very expensive moment of weakness." Marcus felt his temper flare but kept his voice steady. "Your father was completely lucid when he made his decision. He was grateful that someone saved his grandson's life." Victoria's smile was razor-thin. "Gratitude is one thing, Mr. Rivera. Giving away a $12 million estate to a janitor is quite another. I'm prepared to offer you a generous settlement, say $50,000, for you to sign over the deed and disappear from our lives." Marcus had grown up in a working-class family where integrity mattered more than money, and Victoria's dismissive attitude sparked something fierce in his chest. "I'm not interested in your money, Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard work and honest living. "Your father gave me this house freely and legally. The paperwork is in order, and I have no intention of leaving." Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of anger crossing her perfect features before she regained control. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This house has been in the Whitmore family for generations. You're a stranger, an interloper who thinks one good deed entitles him to a lifetime of luxury." Marcus stood up, his own anger finally breaking through his careful politeness. "One good deed? I saved your nephew's life. Maybe that doesn't mean much to you, but it meant everything to your father." Victoria's mask of cold professionalism cracked completely at the mention of Jamie, and for a moment Marcus saw something raw and painful flash in her green eyes. She turned away, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house, it's all I have left of my family." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did Marcus. She straightened immediately, rebuilding her defenses, but the damage was done. He'd glimpsed the woman beneath the corporate armor, and what he'd seen was devastating loneliness masquerading as strength. "Your father loves you," Marcus said gently, unsure why he felt compelled to offer comfort to someone who just tried to buy him off. "He talks about you sometimes. He's proud of what you've accomplished, even if he doesn't know how to tell you." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Love and pride don't pay for private jets and penthouses, Mr. Rivera. Business does. Family legacy does. And you're living in the heart of ours." Victoria turned from the window with renewed determination, her momentary vulnerability buried beneath layers of practiced composure. "I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Rivera, and I suggest you consider it carefully. I'll give you 6 months to enjoy playing Lord of the Manor. 6 months to realize that you don't belong in this world, that the money and maintenance and social obligations will crush you." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the old windows. "And if I don't realize that?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Victoria's smile was predatory. "Then I'll make your life so complicated, so legally challenging, and so publicly humiliating that you'll beg me to take this house off your hands. I have resources you can't imagine, Mr. Rivera. I can make problems appear and disappear with a phone call. The question is, are you prepared for a war you can't possibly win?" That night, Marcus lay awake in the massive master bedroom, Victoria's words echoing in his mind like a threat made real. Through the tall windows, he could see the outline of the gardens he'd grown to love, the peaceful landscape that had become his sanctuary. Now even the familiar shadows seemed ominous, full of legal challenges and social humiliations he couldn't begin to imagine. He thought about his simple life before the manor, the predictable routine of work, the modest apartment, the absence of complications or enemies. It would be easy to take Victoria's money and disappear, to return to the invisibility that had once comforted him. But every time he considered surrender, he thought of Harrison's grateful eyes and Jamie's shy smile. Some gifts came with responsibilities that couldn't be bought or sold. By morning, Marcus had made his decision. If Victoria Whitmore wanted a war, she would have one. Marcus's first phone call was to Harrison, who listened to his daughter's ultimatum with a silence that spoke volumes. When the old man finally spoke, his voice was tired but resolute. "Victoria has always been brilliant, but she's forgotten that intelligence without wisdom is just sophisticated foolishness. You have my complete support, Marcus, legal and financial. That house is yours, and no amount of corporate maneuvering will change that." The second call was to Jamie, who surprised Marcus with his fierce loyalty. "Aunt Victoria is scary smart," the teenager admitted, "but she doesn't understand people the way you do. She thinks everything can be solved with money or threats, but she's never had to fight for anything that really mattered. You saved my life, Marcus. Now let me help save yours." Within hours, Marcus found himself with a team of advisors he never could have afforded, all working pro bono at Harrison's direction. Victoria Whitmore might have resources, but she'd forgotten that her father had built an empire, and empires have deep pockets. Victoria's first attack came disguised as a gift. A team of inspectors arrived at the manor unannounced, claiming to be conducting a routine safety evaluation required by the county. They swarmed through the house with clipboards and measuring devices, finding violations that seemed to materialize out of thin air. A railing that was half an inch too low, electrical outlets that didn't meet current code, windows that lacked proper egress markings. Marcus watched them work with growing understanding. Each violation would require expensive repairs, permits, and months of bureaucratic navigation. It was death by 1,000 cuts, designed to drain his resources and patience until surrender seemed like relief. But Victoria had underestimated her opponent. Marcus had spent 12 years maintaining buildings, understanding their systems and requirements. He recognized half the violations as bogus and knew exactly which officials to call to contest them. The war had begun, but he was better armed than she'd anticipated. Within a week, Marcus found himself in meetings with lawyers who charged more per hour than he used to make in a month. Victoria had apparently hired a team of her own, specialists in property law and inheritance disputes, all working to find some angle that would invalidate Harrison's gift. They challenged the mental competency evaluation, questioned the timing of the deed transfer, and demanded a full forensic accounting of the property's value. Marcus's legal team, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Brenda Lucas who'd been Harrison's personal attorney for 20 years, met each challenge with precision and patience. Victoria is fishing, Brenda explained during one of their strategy sessions. She's hoping to find some procedural error that will void the transfer, but Mr. Harrison was careful. Every document was properly notarized, witnessed, and filed. She can make noise, but she can't change facts. Still, the legal fees were mounting, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder if Victoria's real strategy was simply to bankrupt him through the cost of defending what was rightfully his. Marcus first learned about the newspaper article when his former co-workers at Westfield Academy began staring at him with mixture of awe and suspicion. The Hartford Courant had run a feature piece titled From Janitor to Millionaire, a modern fairy tale, that presented his story with just enough skepticism to plant seeds of doubt about his motives and character. The article, which Victoria had clearly orchestrated, painted Marcus as an opportunistic gold digger who'd somehow manipulated a grieving old man into signing over valuable property. Anonymous sources questioned whether the drowning had been as serious as claimed, suggesting that Marcus might have exaggerated the danger to increase his reward. Reading the piece felt like watching his reputation being systematically dismantled by someone who'd never bothered to learn his actual character. But the article had an unintended consequence. It brought Marcus sympathy from people who recognized the attempted character assassination for what it was. The response to the newspaper article surprised everyone, including Victoria. Letters to the editor poured in from Westfield Academy families, faculty, and staff, all defending Marcus's character and work ethic. Parents whose children he'd helped, teachers who'd worked alongside him, and administrators who'd trusted him with their keys and security codes spoke up with unanimous support. Marcus Rivera is the most honest man I've ever known, wrote the Academy's headmaster. In 12 years of employment, he never took so much as a paper clip that didn't belong to him. The mother of a student with special needs described how Marcus had spent his lunch breaks helping her son navigate social challenges, never asking for recognition or additional compensation. By the end of the week, the newspaper had received so many pro-Marcus letters that they ran a follow-up piece highlighting his community support. Victoria's attempt to destroy his reputation had backfired spectacularly, turning him into a local hero rather than a villain. Marcus was shopping for groceries in the small downtown market when he literally collided with Victoria in the produce section. She was examining apples with the same intensity she probably brought to hotel acquisitions, and his cart bumped into hers as he rounded the corner. For a moment, they stared at each other in mutual surprise, the artificially lit grocery store an absurdly mundane setting for their ongoing battle. "Mr. Rivera," Victoria said, recovering first and offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How domestic of you." Marcus noticed she was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe style. Without the armor of her business attire, she looked younger, more approachable, and undeniably beautiful in a way that caught him off guard. "Ms. Whitmore," he replied, suddenly aware that his own appearance, work clothes and day-old stubble, probably reinforced her opinion of him as unsuitable for refined society. "Enjoying your visit home?" Victoria's polite facade slipped slightly at his question, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something that might have been homesickness in her expression. "Connecticut has changed," she said, looking around the modest grocery store with what seemed like genuine nostalgia. "I remember when this place was owned by the Kowalski family. They knew everyone's name and would let kids steal penny candy when they thought no one was looking." The admission of warmth toward her childhood home seemed to surprise her as much as it did Marcus. She straightened immediately, rebuilding her defenses, but not before he'd seen the human being beneath the corporate executive. "People change too," Marcus said gently, "but sometimes the good parts remain, even when we think they're lost." Victoria's green eyes studied his face as if searching for some hidden agenda. Then she shook her head with something that might have been regret. "Pretty words, Mr. Rivera, but they don't change the facts. That house belongs to my family, and I will have it back." The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering, the kind of formal elegance that screamed old money and established society. The Millbrook Historical Society was hosting its annual winter gala, and Marcus had been invited as the new owner of Whitmore Manor. The event was clearly a test Victoria's way of exposing him as a fish out of water in the rarefied social circles that came with his inherited position. Marcus stared at the invitation for a long time, knowing that accepting would be walking into a carefully orchestrated humiliation. The dress code alone, black tie, represented a level of formal dress he'd never experienced. But refusing would be seen as proof that he didn't belong in this world, validating Victoria's argument that he was unsuited for the responsibilities of owning the manor. After an hour of internal debate, Marcus made a decision that would have surprised his younger self. He would attend the gala, and he would do everything in his power to belong. Shopping for formal wear was an education in how the other half lived. The sales associate at the high-end men's store in Greenwich treated Marcus with polite condescension until he mentioned Whitmore Manor, then suddenly became obsequiously helpful. The tuxedo cost more than Marcus used to spend on groceries in 3 months, but Harrison had insisted on covering all expenses related to maintaining his new social position. Marcus practiced with YouTube videos, learning to tie a bow tie and navigate the mysterious world of formal dining etiquette. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years cleaning up after these events at the academy, invisible among the waitstaff and caterers, never imagining he'd one day be expected to participate as a guest. But as he studied the rules of upper-class behavior, Marcus realized that much of it was performance, carefully choreographed rituals designed to identify insiders and exclude those who didn't know the steps. The Millbrook Country Club had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with white roses and silver lights creating an atmosphere of elegant sophistication. Marcus arrived fashionably late, as Brenda Lucas had advised, and made his entrance with the quiet confidence he'd been practicing. The tuxedo fit perfectly, and his natural dignity carried him through the initial moments of surprised stares and whispered conversations. Victoria was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a carefully curated group of society matrons and business leaders. She wore a midnight blue evening gown that hugged her figure perfectly, her dark hair swept up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. When their eyes met across the room, Marcus saw surprise flicker across her features before being replaced by cool assessment. She'd expected him to stumble, to embarrass himself through ignorance of social customs. Instead, he moved through the crowd with natural grace, accepting congratulations on his inheritance and deflecting invasive questions with polite humor. Marcus had been avoiding the dance floor for most of the evening, knowing that ballroom dancing was one social grace he hadn't managed to master through online tutorials. But when the band struck up a waltz and several couples moved onto the polished floor, he found himself thinking of his mother, who tried to teach him to dance in their tiny apartment kitchen when he was 12. "You're brooding," a familiar voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find Victoria approaching, her evening gown rustling softly against the marble floor. The strong, silent type only works if you actually participate in the event you're attending. Before he could respond, she'd taken his hand and was leading him toward the dance floor with the kind of casual authority that brooked no argument. "I assume you know how to waltz?" she asked, and Marcus caught the challenge in her voice. "We're about to find out," he replied, surprising them both with his honesty. To Victoria's obvious surprise, Marcus could dance. Not with the polished technique of someone trained at expensive dance studios, but with the natural rhythm and gentle strength that came from years of physical work. His mother's kitchen lessons had been supplemented by high school proms and wedding receptions, and his innate sense of music carried him through the formal steps of the waltz. Victoria felt different in his arms than he'd expected, softer, more vulnerable, as if the physical closeness had temporarily dissolved her carefully maintained barriers. She smelled like expensive perfume and something uniquely her own, and Marcus found himself distracted by the way her eyes seemed to darken in the dim light of the ballroom. "You're full of surprises," she murmured as he spun her gracefully, and for a moment her voice held none of its usual edge. When the music ended, they stood for just a beat too long in each other's arms, both seeming to realize simultaneously that something had shifted between them. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful observation. Marcus found himself watching Victoria when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way she commanded attention without seeming to try, the graceful way she moved between social groups, the flash of genuine warmth when she spoke to older guests who'd known her as a child. She was magnificent in her element, and he was beginning to understand that her coldness might be armor rather than nature. Victoria, meanwhile, was reassessing everything she thought she knew about Marcus Rivera. He'd navigated the social minefield of the gala with surprising aplomb, charming the Historical Society board members and holding his own in conversations about art, literature, and current events. More troubling was the way her pulse had quickened during their dance, the unexpected attraction she'd felt when his strong hands had guided her around the floor. She'd come to Connecticut to reclaim her inheritance, not to develop feelings for the man standing in her way. Marcus offered to drive Victoria back to her hotel, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to surprise her. The ride through the darkened Connecticut countryside was filled with the kind of charged silence that follows an evening of unexpected discoveries. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of his modest sedan, her elegant gown a stark contrast to the car's practical interior, and Marcus found himself hyper-aware of every breath she took. "Thank you," she said quietly as they pulled into the hotel's circular drive. "For the dance, for the ride. For not embarrassing yourself tonight." There was something almost vulnerable in her admission, as if she'd been hoping he would fail and was unsettled by his success. Marcus turned to look at her, struck by how different she seemed in the car's intimate confines compared to the public persona she'd displayed all evening. "Did you want me to embarrass myself?" he asked. Victoria's smile was rueful. "I thought it would make things easier if you did. Now I'm not sure what I think anymore." Marcus woke the next morning with Victoria's words echoing in his mind and the phantom sensation of her hand in his. The gala had changed something fundamental between them, creating a crack in the wall of animosity that had defined their relationship. As he made coffee in the Manor's enormous kitchen, Marcus found himself wondering what Victoria was like when she wasn't trying to intimidate or manipulate, when she was just a woman with her own fears and desires. The questions troubled him because they suggested a level of interest that went beyond simple curiosity about his adversary. Victoria Whitmore was beautiful, intelligent, and successful. Everything he should admire in a woman. She was also trying to destroy his life and steal his home, which should have made any romantic feelings impossible. But the heart, Marcus was learning, didn't always cooperate with logic, and the memory of her softness in his arms refused to be dismissed as easily as he'd hoped. Victoria called that afternoon with a proposition that caught Marcus completely off guard. "I'm extending my stay in Connecticut," she said without preamble, her voice carrying its usual crisp authority. "I'd like to propose a temporary ceasefire. No legal maneuvers, no media campaigns, no attempts to force you out of the house. In return, I want unrestricted access to the Manor for the next month." Marcus set down his book, immediately suspicious of her motives. "What kind of access?" he asked. Victoria's pause suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "I want to spend time in the house where I grew up, to go through my mother's things, to remember what it felt like to be part of a family. Call it sentimentality, call it closure. I need this before I can walk away." The vulnerability in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus found himself agreeing before his rational mind could voice its objections. Some battles he was learning were worth losing. Having Victoria in the manor every day created a strange domestic intimacy that neither of them had anticipated. She would arrive each morning with coffee and pastries from the local bakery, settling into the library or the sunroom to work on her laptop while Marcus went about his routines. They moved around each other like cautious dancers, polite and distant, but hyper-aware of each other's presence. Marcus began to see sides of Victoria that challenged his preconceptions. She was gentle with the manor's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, spending long afternoons listening to stories about the family's history. She had an extensive knowledge of art and literature, often pausing to examine the paintings and first edition books that filled the house. Most surprisingly, she seemed genuinely interested in the maintenance and preservation of the property, asking intelligent questions about heating systems and structural repairs. The corporate ice queen was revealing herself to be a woman who cared deeply about beautiful things and their preservation. It was Victoria who discovered the hidden room. She'd been exploring the manor's third floor, an area that had once housed servants' quarters and was now mostly used for storage, when she noticed an architectural inconsistency. The hallway seemed shorter than it should be, and careful measurement revealed a space that didn't appear on any of the house's floor plans. Marcus helped her move aside a heavy wardrobe that had been positioned against what appeared to be a solid wall, revealing a narrow door that had been painted over so many times it was nearly invisible. Behind the door was a small room filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, portrait paintings stacked against the walls, and several trunks that appeared to have been untouched for decades. "This was my grandmother's sitting room," Victoria said, her voice filled with wonder. "I thought all her things had been sold after she died." As they began to explore the hidden cache, both realized they were on the verge of uncovering family secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Among the covered paintings was a portrait that took Victoria's breath away. It showed a young woman with dark hair and green eyes, wearing a 1940s style dress and sitting in the manor's garden. The resemblance to Victoria was unmistakable, but the woman in the painting had a warmth and joy that Victoria's own features rarely displayed. "That's my grandmother, Elena," Victoria said softly, running her fingers along the gilded frame. "My father never talks about her. I've only seen one photograph, from their wedding day." Marcus studied the portrait, struck by the artist's skill in capturing not just the woman's beauty but her spirit. Elena Whitmore looked like someone who laughed easily and loved deeply, traits that seemed to have skipped a generation. "Why would he hide this?" Marcus asked. Victoria shook her head, but her expression was troubled. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. There are too many gaps in our family history, too many questions that no one will answer." The trunks yielded the greatest treasures. Hundreds of letters tied with faded ribbon, written in a flowing script that spoke of education and elegance. Victoria began reading them aloud, her voice growing softer with each revelation. The letters were love notes, passionate and romantic, written by a man named Michael to Elena during what appeared to be a secret courtship in the 1940s. "My dearest Elena," Victoria read, "every moment apart from you feels like an eternity. I know your father disapproves of our attachment, but I cannot help believing that love will find a way. You are my sun, my moon, my every star in the darkness." Marcus found himself drawn into the story, watching Victoria's face as she discovered a grandmother she'd never really known. The letters painted Elena as a passionate, independent woman who defied her family's expectations to follow her heart. But why had these letters been hidden, and who was Michael? The discovery of the hidden room had created an unexpected partnership between Marcus and Victoria. They spent hours cataloging the contents, carefully preserving documents and photographs that told the story of a family history far more complex than anyone had realized. Working side by side, they began to shed their respective armors of defensiveness and hostility. Marcus found himself charmed by Victoria's genuine excitement over each new discovery. The way her eyes lit up when she found a photograph of her grandmother or a piece of jewelry she remembered from childhood. Victoria, meanwhile, was impressed by Marcus's careful handling of the fragile artifacts, his respect for family history that wasn't even his own. She began to understand why her father had trusted this man with something so precious. More troubling was the growing awareness that Marcus Rivera was nothing like the opportunistic gold digger she'd convinced herself he was. The evening Victoria stayed for dinner marked a significant shift in their relationship. What had begun as a practical arrangement. It was late, they were both hungry, and the Manor's kitchen was enormous, became something more intimate as they cooked together. Victoria proved surprisingly adept at preparing simple meals, and Marcus discovered that she had opinions about everything from seasoning to wine pairings. They ate in the Manor's breakfast nook rather than the formal dining room, the smaller space creating a coziness that felt natural despite their complicated history. Over pasta and wine, Victoria began sharing stories about her childhood in the house, memories both bitter and sweet. "I used to slide down the main staircase banister when my parents weren't looking," she admitted. "Mrs. Patterson would pretend to scold me, but I could tell she was trying not to laugh." Marcus could picture her as a mischievous child, before life had taught her to guard her heart so carefully. The second bottle of wine loosened tongues and lowered defenses. Victoria curled up in her chair, her expensive shoes kicked off and her usually perfect hair falling softly around her shoulders. "Do you know why I really left Connecticut?" she asked, her voice slightly slurred but her eyes clear and focused. "It wasn't just about college or career opportunities. I couldn't stand watching my father love Jamie more than he'd ever loved me." The admission hung between them, raw and painful in its honesty. Marcus set down his wine glass, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to voice such a deep hurt. "Love isn't a competition," he said gently. "Your father talks about you all the time. He's proud of what you've built, even if he doesn't know how to tell you." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Pride and love are different things, Marcus. You can be proud of someone's accomplishments while wishing they were someone else entirely." The kiss happened without planning or conscious decision. Victoria had been showing Marcus a photograph of her grandmother, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body and smell the wine on her breath. When she looked up at him, her green eyes wide and vulnerable in the lamplight, the distance between them seemed to disappear without either of them moving. Their lips met softly, tentatively, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile. Victoria tasted like wine and possibility, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this woman was becoming important to him in ways that had nothing to do with the house or their legal battle. When they finally broke apart, Victoria stepped back with a look of confusion and something that might have been panic. "This is a mistake," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "The biggest one I've ever made." Victoria was gone when Marcus woke the next morning, her absence more noticeable than her presence had been. She'd left a brief note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for dinner. I need some time to think. V." The formal tone and careful distance suggested that their moment of intimacy had been filed away as an aberration, something to be forgotten rather than explored. Marcus spent the day replaying the kiss, analyzing every nuance and wondering if he'd imagined the way Victoria had melted into his arms. The rational part of his mind agreed that it had been a mistake. They were on opposite sides of a legal battle. Their worlds were fundamentally incompatible. and any romantic involvement would only complicate an already complex situation. But his heart refused to cooperate with such logical analysis, insisting that what he'd felt in that moment had been real and worth pursuing, regardless of the complications it might create. Victoria stayed away from the manor for 3 days, conducting her business from her hotel room and avoiding the places where she might accidentally encounter Marcus. But the absence felt like punishment, both for herself and for him. She'd tasted something she hadn't even known she was hungry for: acceptance, understanding, the possibility of being valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. On the 4th day, she returned to find Marcus in the hidden room, carefully cleaning and cataloging the items they discovered together. He looked up when she entered, his expression cautious but hopeful. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said quietly. Victoria felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling at the gentle welcome in his voice. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But I realized that running away from this won't make it disappear. We need to finish what we started." She was talking about the room, the family history, the cataloging project. But they both understood she meant something deeper. Hidden in the bottom of the largest trunk was Elena's diary, bound in cracked leather and filled with entries spanning several years. Victoria opened it with reverent hands, as if she were handling a religious artifact. The entries began in 1942, when Elena was 19, and painted a picture of a young woman caught between duty and desire, family expectations, and personal dreams. "Father has forbidden me to see Michael again," one entry read. "He says a Catholic gardener's son is unsuitable for a Whitmore daughter, that I must think of the family name and my position in society. But how can I think of anything when my heart belongs so completely to someone else?" Victoria read aloud, her voice growing thick with emotion. Marcus watched her discover that the grandmother she'd idealized had faced the same impossible choice between love and family loyalty that now confronted Victoria herself. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, and too painful to discuss openly. The diary revealed that Elena's romance with Michael had divided the Whitmore family for years. Elena's father, Harrison's grandfather, had threatened to disinherit her if she married beneath her station. Her mother had been more sympathetic but ultimately sided with her husband, believing that love without social and financial security was a luxury the family couldn't afford. "I am 23 and unmarried," read one particularly poignant entry. "Father grows more insistent that I accept Charles Morrison's proposal, though I feel nothing for him beyond polite friendship. Michael writes to me still, though I cannot answer his letters. Sometimes I think it would be kinder to break his heart completely than to keep him hoping for something that can never be." Victoria's voice broke on the last words, and Marcus reached over to take her hand. The gesture was meant to comfort, but the contact sent electricity through both of them, a reminder of the attraction they were trying to ignore. The diary's most shocking revelation came near the end. Elena had secretly married Michael in a small ceremony performed by a sympathetic priest. They'd lived as husband and wife for 6 months, meeting in secret while Elena maintained the fiction of spinsterhood for her family's benefit. The entries from this period glowed with happiness and fulfilled love, describing stolen afternoons and whispered promises of a future together. But the joy was short-lived. Michael had been drafted into the army and sent to the Pacific Theater. His letters to Elena, carefully preserved in the trunk, spoke of his determination to survive the war and return to claim his wife openly. The last letter was dated 3 weeks before his death on a beach in the Philippines, full of plans for the life they would build together when the fighting ended. Victoria wiped away tears as she read his final words. "Wait for me, my darling. Love will find a way, as it always has." The diary explained much about Harrison's character and his complicated relationship with love and family. Elena had married Richard Whitmore 6 months after receiving news of Michael's death, A marriage of convenience that produced Harrison but little else in the way of happiness. She'd been a dutiful wife and devoted mother, but the diary made clear that her heart had died with Michael on that distant battlefield. "I look at my son and see his father's features," Elena wrote when Harrison was 5 years old. "But sometimes, when he laughs or makes some generous gesture, I see Michael in him, and it breaks my heart all over again. I pray that Harrison will be braver than I was, that he will choose love over duty when his time comes." Victoria closed the diary with shaking hands, finally understanding why her father had such complicated feelings about the manor, and why he'd given it to a man who'd risked everything for love. The discovery of Elena's true story created a new intimacy between Marcus and Victoria. They sat in the hidden room surrounded by the artifacts of a love story that had been buried for decades, both understanding that they were facing the same impossible choice that had defined Elena's life. The attraction between them could no longer be denied, but the circumstances seemed designed to keep them apart. "She chose duty," Victoria said quietly, staring at the portrait of her grandmother. "And it destroyed her." Marcus moved closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. "She chose what she thought was right for her family," he corrected gently. "That's not the same thing as duty." Victoria looked at him then, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Isn't it? I've spent my entire adult life building something I thought would make my father proud, trying to prove I was worthy of the Whitmore name. But what if I've been as wrong as she was?" The second kiss was different from the first, urgent, desperate, born of the knowledge that they were standing at a crossroads where any decision would change everything. Victoria initiated it this time, reaching for Marcus with trembling hands as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. They made love in the hidden room, surrounded by the secrets and regrets of past generations, their passion fierce and tender by turns. It was simultaneously the most natural thing in the world and the most dangerous choice either of them had ever made. Afterward, lying in each other's arms on the dusty floor, they both understood that there would be no going back to polite hostility and careful distance. They had crossed a line that would define the rest of their lives, one way or another. Victoria moved into the manor the next day, abandoning the pretense that their relationship was purely adversarial. They established a careful routine, working together in the hidden room during the day, sharing meals in the evening, falling into each other's arms with the desperate intensity of people who knew their time might be limited. But the outside world hadn't disappeared. Harrison called to check on Marcus's well-being, his voice carefully neutral when Marcus mentioned that Victoria was staying at the house. Jamie visited for a weekend and immediately sensed the change in the atmosphere, though he was tactful enough not to comment directly. And Victoria's business obligations in Europe were piling up, requiring increasingly frantic phone calls and video conferences that reminded them both that she had a life to return to. Harrison's reaction to news of their relationship was surprisingly measured. "I've been waiting for something like this," he told Marcus during a private lunch in the city. "Victoria has been alone too long, and you've shown more honor and integrity than any man she's likely to meet in her corporate world. But are you prepared for what this means? She's brilliant and strong-willed, and she's never learned to trust easily." Jamie was more direct in his enthusiasm. "Aunt Victoria actually smiles now," he told Marcus with teenage candor. "I've never seen her happy before, not really. Whatever you're doing, don't stop." But the boy's innocence couldn't hide the complexity of the situation. Victoria was still technically trying to reclaim the house, still legally Marcus's adversary, even as she shared his bed and his dreams. The contradiction couldn't last forever. Victoria's European business partners were growing impatient with her extended absence. Conference calls interrupted their quiet mornings, and urgent emails demanded decisions that required her physical presence in Paris. Marcus watched her struggle with the competing demands of her professional obligations and her newfound happiness, seeing the stress in the tight line of her shoulders and the distracted look in her eyes during business conversations. "I have to go back," she told him one evening, her voice heavy with regret. "At least for a few weeks. There are contracts that need to be signed, acquisitions that require my direct oversight. I've built something important, Marcus, and I can't just abandon it." He understood, even as the thought of her leaving felt like a physical blow. They had found something precious together, but Victoria's life existed on a scale that dwarfed their small Connecticut world, and eventually that reality would have to be confronted. Marcus's solution surprised them both. "Come with me to Paris," Victoria said impulsively, the words out of her mouth before she'd fully considered their implications. "You could see my world, understand what I've built. Maybe we could find a way to bridge the gap between your life and mine." The invitation hung between them, filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Marcus considered the offer seriously, imagining himself in Victoria's sophisticated European environment. But even as he pictured elegant restaurants and luxury hotels, he knew that such a life would never truly be his. He was a man who found meaning in simple work and honest relationships, not in the complex machinations of international business. "I can't be someone I'm not," he said gently. "And I don't think you'd want me to try. The question is whether you can find a way to be yourself here with me." Victoria left for Paris on a gray December morning, her departure feeling both inevitable and heartbreaking. They had made no promises, established no timelines for her return, but the unspoken understanding was that she would come back when she could. Marcus drove her to the airport, their goodbye necessarily brief and public, though the intensity of their final kiss suggested depths of feeling that neither had been able to voice. The manor felt impossibly empty without her presence. Marcus wandered through rooms that had become charged with memory. The library where they'd shared wine and confessions, the hidden room where they'd discovered family secrets and each other, the bedroom where they'd learned that love could indeed conquer the distance between two very different worlds. But love, Marcus was discovering, was only the beginning of the battle, not the end of it. Victoria wrote to him every day, long emails that arrived with the European morning and filled Marcus's evenings with glimpses of her world. She described business meetings in elegant conference rooms, dinners at restaurants with Michelin stars, the view from her apartment overlooking the Seine. But between the lines, he could read her loneliness and growing uncertainty about a life that no longer felt like enough. "I went to the Louvre today," she wrote in one email. "Standing in front of the great paintings, I kept thinking about Elena's portrait and wondering about the stories behind all these beautiful faces. I realized that I've spent so many years acquiring and achieving that I've forgotten how to simply experience beauty for its own sake. You taught me that, Marcus. You taught me to slow down and see what's actually in front of me." Victoria called on Christmas Eve, her voice thick with emotion and wine. It was morning in Paris but late evening in Connecticut, and Marcus was sitting by the fireplace in the library, surrounded by the comfortable solitude he'd once preferred to any human company. "I miss you," she said without preamble, the admission torn from her as if against her will. "I miss the way you make coffee in the morning, the way you listen when I read aloud, the way you make me feel like I'm enough just as I am." Marcus closed his eyes, her voice painting pictures of the life they'd briefly shared. "I miss you too," he admitted. "Every day, every hour. The house feels like it's waiting for you to come back." They talked until dawn broke over Connecticut, sharing memories and regrets and the kind of intimate conversation that only comes in the darkness between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. When they finally hung up, both understood that a decision was approaching, one that would determine the shape of their future. Victoria arrived without warning on a snowy January afternoon, appearing at the manor's front door like a figment of Marcus's desperate imagination. She looked different, thinner, more fragile somehow, but with a determination in her green eyes that he'd never seen before. "I quit," she said simply, setting down her suitcases in the foyer. "I sold my share of the company to my partners and bought a one-way ticket home." Marcus stared at her, afraid to believe what her presence seemed to promise. "What about everything you built? Your career, your independence, your life in Europe?" Victoria stepped into his arms with a sigh that seemed to release years of tension. "I realized that none of that mattered if I didn't have someone to share it with. You were right. I can't be someone I'm not, but maybe I can be a better version of who I am, here with you." 6 months later, Marcus and Victoria stood in the garden of Whitmore Manor, surrounded by family and friends who had gathered to witness their wedding. Harrison gave the bride away with tears in his eyes, finally understanding that love was indeed more important than social conventions or family expectations. Jamie served as best man, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted this outcome from the beginning. They had turned the hidden room into a study, filling it with Elena's portrait and Michael's letters as a reminder that love requires courage to survive. Victoria had started a consulting business that allowed her to work from home, using her expertise to help small hotels and bed and breakfasts improve their operations. Marcus continued his work at Westfield Academy, finding that his new social status hadn't changed his fundamental nature or his satisfaction in honest labor. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, Victoria whispered in Marcus's ear, "Elena was wrong, you know. Love did find a way. It just took a generation longer than she expected." Marcus spun her around the dance floor, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them, in the house that had brought them together and would shelter the family they were just beginning to build. Sometimes the best inheritances weren't measured in money or property, but in the courage to choose love over fear, hope over cynicism, and connection over the safety of solitude. The janitor had indeed inherited far more than a mansion. He had claimed a legacy of love that would last for generations to come. So tell me, how did this story make you feel? Yay or nay? Do subscribe for more fascinating stories.